a global non-profit organization dedicated to expanding interdisciplinary neuroscience and psychology education, outreach, and awareness for students. Chinmayi is involved with cognitive neuroscience and traumatic brain injury research, and she's passionate about amplifying the applications of neuroscience as a youth science communicator. For her STEM and community impact efforts, Chinmayi has been recognized as the California Science and Engineering Fair's 2019 Student of the Year, as well as recipient of the Daily Point of Light Award, multiplying Good One in a Million Award, and Presidential Volunteer Service Award recipient. In her free time, Chinmayi enjoys gardening, practicing taekwondo, exploring new music on Spotify, and watching Telugu films with family. I'll turn it over to Chinmayi.
Thanks, folks. Happy to be here today. Hi, everyone. My name is Chinmayi, as mentioned, and I'm going to be sharing about tech and neuroscience applications today. We're really going to be getting interdisciplinary and thinking about what are applications of learning about the brain in general to healthcare, to even a lot more beyond, but in the scope of the current event, we'll be talking about applications to technology and healthcare. So give me a quick second to share my screen. There we go. Does that look good to everyone?
Yes, yeah.
Awesome.
That looks perfect.
Awesome, thank you. Alrighty, so Miriam had that wonderful intro already, so I'm gonna very briefly skim past this. Just about me, I think I'm absolutely a self-identifying brain enthusiast. I love talking about neuroscience and thinking about neuroscience beyond just the study of the brain and behavior and the nervous system, but also thinking about how does this connect to everyday life from the moment that we wake up to the time that we're going to sleep. It has an impact on every one of us, even though we're not thinking or perhaps actively learning about it on a daily basis, right? But I think it's important to maybe take away from this session, maybe even if it's not like really complicated scientific jargon or anything like that, but think about, ways that it can inspire your thinking, the way that you approach connections between different fields. I hope you can walk away with maybe some little smidget of that even. That'll make me very happy. Just a brief overview of what we're going to be running through today. I'm going to give you a general overview of what is the current state of interdisciplinary STEM. So STEM meaning for science, tech, engineering, math. Some people add in medicine to the end as well. I'll give you a very small crash course to neuroscience, setting the stage for
I think Chinmayi froze. Just give us a second.
Yeah, I think she was disconnected from the call. We'll just give it a second here. Okay. No worries.
Hi, sorry. My Wi-Fi just dropped all of a sudden. I hope my dad is not messing with the Wi-Fi network right now. I think he's trying to set the router, but in case I drop off, I have a hotspot. I will be back very quickly, so I apologize in advance.
Did you also make her a co-host?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, perfect.
I can share my screen, thank you. Great, so I think the last thing I was mentioning was current applicable to our current stage S students. How do we ideate? We're not necessarily experts in the field, but we still have a lot of potential. And what are some avenues to explore further beyond the scope of this session? This is a very, very small scale, very intro based. So first question, I'm gonna throw it back to you guys. What does interdisciplinary STEM mean to you? And why the heck does it matter? What's different between the sciences, STEM, versus interdisciplinary STEM? So I believe we should all have unmute permissions, or if you want to drop in the chat, feel free to chime in. I want to hear from you guys. no wrong answers, which is one of the beauties of the interdisciplinary nature. There's no wrong answers. There's always the
So I
awkward
can go. I
Go
can go.
ahead.
So interdisciplinary STEM for me is about incorporating different fields. So engineering, technology, mathematics, science, and even including some of the liberal sciences and social sciences to better understand a certain phenomenon and to just explore it through different angles, through different lenses. So that way, of course, we can get a more kind of overarching understanding of it. And avoiding just looking at just one angle or just one facet of the phenomenon.
Great, yeah, so definitely leading towards the positive connotation. It adds value to the conversation instead of just one track. Hiram said it's basically a mix between two fields, which is actually perfect. Inter, Latin root, between, so right in the middle of different things. I'll be using inter and multi pretty interchangeably. I just used the word inter again there. But basically things to keep in mind are that it's all about meshing those different perspectives together. And the key that you'll notice is collaboration between people who have different, fields of expertise, for instance. A lot of my experiences fall within the neuroscience world, but, to be working with someone who works with engineering, for instance, someone who's working in architectural design, visual design, a lot of different applications to go. For disciplines, yes. So STEM, as the acronym it goes, we tend to throw it out so much, right? Throw it around so much. Science, tech, engineering, and math. A lot of folks tend to categorize learning about the brain within the sciences. You might get some folks who are like, well, learning about the brain is actually psychology, which is a social science. Is that the science that's in STEM? Is that outside? We don't know. But the neat thing about, this interdisciplinary STEM approach is that we're breaking a lot of that segmentation up. As this quote really reads wonderfully, none of us can accomplish this important science alone, right? We're not going to get much out of the world if we're sitting here arguing whether learning about the brain is a life science or a social science. And sometimes that segmentation in academia can get in the way. As an example, when hopefully, a few decades into the future, when we're all applying for, let's say, grants for scientific research, or we're in the clinical realm, or whatever we're doing, we may be applying for grants along the way from the government, right? And sometimes, you're kind of checking the boxes on what fields your research or your work fits into. And for scientists who are trying to get outside of the box a little bit, because obviously, understanding the human body and the brain is not necessarily like, we're going to check the boxes and be straightforward. It's complicated. So it doesn't always check into the box of this is only molecular analysis. This is only cellular and cellular neurophysiology and things like that. Science doesn't work that way, right? We like to categorize ourselves to add structure, but it can also get in the way oftentimes. I know in personal experiences in college, I kind of put myself at the intersection of the humanities majors and the natural sciences majors. And for a lot of folks, if you are a humanities major, but with a science interest, sometimes you don't always qualify for science activities, right? You can't always apply to research internships and whatnot. So there's a lot of structure that is nice in that, it aligns ourselves with where we're going and guides our research methodologies, but also gets in the way. Now, obviously, lack of funding is one big thing, because as mentioned, governments and agencies, all these folks like to fund things that, meet the best requirements, right? Like if I'm an organization that provides grants to behavioral neuroscientists, I may be more likely to fund the more traditional behavioral neuro research than something that's more unpredictable. We don't really know if this is gonna, bring out results. It's crossing behavioral neuro and engineering and imaging and all these different things, a little bit more complex. It's a little risky. When it comes to the funding end. So that's another big barrier. There's a lot of potential. It is, this second quote here also reads that there's a lot to gain from just being, situating yourself at these intersections. Even between research laboratories and universities, you might see that labs often collaborate, right? You might have department-wide symposiums and whatnot. We have spaces like these where obviously, there's not just neuroscientists, right? You have a very wide range of folks coming in to share their experiences with you. All of you guys have different backgrounds. And we're all, building, the broader understanding of what sciences mean, right? Neuroscience is one of those very multidisciplinary fields because it encompasses so much to understand the brain. There really is, it's really one of those top scientific studies, in my opinion. The pressing ones are obviously, you've got things like environmental science, which are very important for survival. But neuroscience affects a lot of people, not only on the everyday basis, like I mentioned, but there's also a lot of different neurological conditions. When we're growing, you can often see that neurodevelopmental delays may be present for some of our peers, but then they tend to disappear during adulthood or they last. There's a lot of complicated things that we still don't understand about the brain. Neuroplasticity is one. How do we recover from injury is one. How is mental illness based in actually biochemical pathways in the brain? Breaking down stigma, understanding how we can develop better therapies for treatment, all these things come to mind, when you hear neuroscience. Not just, there's this really cool neuroscientist out there who does like technologies and he can read your mind, like in the movies. No, there's a lot more out there, right? So I'll give you a brief overview to set the stage for different technologies that we're going to talk about, though. The important things to keep in mind are that the brain has billions of neurons. Neurons are these specialized cells. We're going to have a little biology 101 here, but there are these specialized cells that are putting information all over the place in your brain, taking in information from the outside world, and conveying that to you. And these are setting the stage for different kinds of responses, right? Like when I receive a stimuli, like I see Mohammed nodding, I don't just sit here and process for 5 minutes. That is a nod. You're right, the brain is really rapidly processing things. So conscious and unconscious movements, like if I edged too close to a candle and I move my hand back because, oh my gosh, I'm burning my finger, that's a little bit unconscious response there. It's built into your, reflex stimuli patterns, which is a topic for another day. But things like that, your brain programs those. Conscious thoughts like, I'm going to go open my door. I'm going to go open my window. Those are decisions that you make, and these neuronal transmissions form the basis for that. Thoughts, emotions, memories, all these are also programmed into the neurons. Kind of interesting to think about how emotions, they're so complex, but it's also just neurons chatting away in your brain. That set the stage for that. Something to keep in mind. So another important thing to keep in mind is that the brain is not just a lump of mush where you have neurons flying all over the place, like I make it seem just now. They are very organized. So you've got different regions in the brain that are specialized for different tasks. Like I mentioned, when I pick up my phone, abilities like, oh, there's food, I'm gonna eat that food. And now it tastes very yummy and now my stomach is full. One example that I love to point out is towards the front part of your skull. This is not an accurate scientific point out example. I wish I had one of those, brain models. But towards the front of your brain, you've got what's known as the frontal lobe, which is really involved with executive functions like thinking, planning, organizing. You've got other parts like the occipital lobe, temporal lobe. You're not going to be quizzed on these, that help you process visual information. Like that flower over there is pink. That bird over there that's being really annoying right now it has yellow feathers. So a lot of different information that's being processed. Some of it you don't pick up on, some of it you do pick up on, actively processing it. But a lot of behind the scenes going on basically is what's important to matter. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about how the heck those neurons are chatting with one another, because it's going to set the stage for neurotechnology innovations. And you're going to see how, these little itty bitty functions and things that we don't think about, right? I'm not thinking right now about what neurons are firing and what are communicating, obviously. But these are really, the tiny little pieces mean so much down the line when you think about applications to the clinical setting. So 86 billion neurons in the brain, there's a lot. This is also an estimate for some folks. It can range from 86 to 100 billion. As you're growing, into adulthood, it also changes. Parts of our brain don't actually, finish growing and modifying and adapting themselves until you're in your late 20s. Neurons communicate through electrical signals and chemical signals. And I'm not going to go very into depth about how these chemical interactions and everything function, but what's the most important pathway to remember is there's some sort of stimuli in our environment, like the bird or the flower I mentioned. You sense that. It's transmitted through these very rapidly firing hundreds of miles per hour electrical signals that are known as action potentials, and they basically jump along from these little gaps called synapses. There's a synaptic cleft, basically, and they kind of jump along from neuron to neuron, called saltatory conduction, if you're really into big terms. And these signals are what cause our muscles to contract and move, for my jaw to move and talk to you right now. But this is the ideal process. There's also ways that this can go wrong. And exercise can play a big impact in how your neuronal transmission is functioning. Stress, alcohol, drug use impairments, all of these can also impact the information processing capacity of your brain, which is one of the many factors for why, for instance, when you are under the influence of alcohol, you're not able to drive well, right? Your judgment is impaired. Part of that is related to neuronal communication, right? When you're stressed out and you're all over the place, one of the reasons. So in summary, all of our thoughts and behaviors stem from really minute, minuscule neuronal communication patterns. So something interesting to think about. Shout out to the neurons. They do a lot for us. I don't think about them as much. Here's a little picture of two neurons, actually. So neuron number one over here, the cell has got its headquarters. This is a little bit of bio throwback again. It's got the nucleus. You're not going to be tested on this once again. It's just for, visualizing. They've got this headquarters that receives information and it sends it out along this whitish grayish little line here called the axon, transmits, and then it moves on and on and on, just jumping along. So that is the neuron. Welcome to the neuron. Now, I've been hinting that there's so many technologies that are using this, neuronal electrical signaling, yada, 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 yada. But that's a very vague reference to something. And there's often one company, hint, hint, that's in the news a lot recently that's using neurotechnology, neuroscience technologies. But can you name any current technologies that you are guessing, or maybe you know for sure, that are linked to neuroscience? Using some form of, it could be inspirations, AI, it could be, mental health therapy route, how using the brain as the basis for these technologies. Any ideas? Shout them out. Chat here. Are you guys hearing about any really famous neuro-related companies that are in the news lately? Startups? There's one very big one that everyone knows. EEG headbands. Yes, absolutely. Neuralink. Ding, 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 ding. We're going to be using them as an example to understand some of those big questions I was mentioning. They're going to be our little case study for today. The thing I want to acknowledge is that these companies really do move so quickly. So Neuralink, for instance, is testing so many different things right now. And the things that you learn about right now are probably different from what they were, 2 months ago. So the content is always evolving. That's the neat thing with these, different startups and companies too, is that what we know about the brain is always expanding. And so it's kind of it's a neat little race, but kind of like a joint race where you're trying to keep up with the research of just purely understanding what in the world is the brain. And the other end, you're trying to understand, okay, how do we take that and try to help understand, further, help the lived experience of patients and whatnot. So that is this neat symbiotic, sometimes not so symbiotic relationship. That is something I'll talk about as well. AstraZeneca, yeah, it's a bunch of companies out there. Came across a database the other day of over 1,000 neuro and psychology related startups, which is insane to think about and amazing. There's a lot out there, from trying to address migraines to trying to develop therapies for Alzheimer's, to trying to develop rehabilitation methods for paralysis patients who aren't able to move their limbs. A lot going on. So before we dive into good old friend Neuralink, I'm going to very briefly tell you about brain-computer interfaces and how exactly, you know, the understanding of the brain, biology and whatnot combines together with the tech aspect a little bit. So you just heard me say brain-computer interfaces, but I also want you to keep in mind that beyond the scope of our little call here today, there's a bunch of other names for them, including brain-machine interfaces, neural control interfaces, mind-machine, direct, there's a bunch out there. So don't get confused, you know, there's probably some alternate names for a lot of these technologies. But to summarize, brain-computer interfaces, they are communicating, just like the name says, between a brain and a computer or some sort of machine, picking up on these electrical activities that are going on in the brain, right? Computer is a lot of activity going on, but the brain is also a computer in that same sense. That's why some folks are trying to reverse engineer the brain artificially, because it's like a computer in many senses. Maybe a supercomputer would be better. But Mohammed mentioned EEG headbands before. There are these devices basically that allow us to measure the brain activity. All these neurons firing and wiring and going all over the place. We try to pick up on those to analyze them and determine what we can do with that, right? We need some sort of, you know, quantitative standard to try to use and go from there and measure, right? In terms of like, what is the brain normally doing versus what is the brain doing when you're sleep deprived, right? You can measure those activities. So there are often these electrodes. You'll see these in the movies, I feel, a lot of times when someone is in has fainted or is in a coma and they've got these electrodes on their head. It's a way to basically pick up on the activity that the brain is producing. So something interesting to visualize there. You picture recording brain activity. You can picture this handy dandy little, electrodes stuck all over your skull, basically. All right, so let's dive into Neuralink now. This video has always given me a hard time with the audio and the video syncing up. So I'm just gonna keep it on mute. I turn on subtitles and I'm gonna walk you through this, all right? So it's got some really nice visuals. This is from August, right? So I mentioned the pace is always picking up and things have probably changed from then to now, but this is like a really neat introductory example. I think some of us are already familiar with Elon Musk, and this is run by Elon Musk & Co., so you'll see him popping up. What happened in this tech demo that they're talking about is there's meet Gertrude the pig. Gertrude the pig was tested on basically in a live demo. There was this brain activity recording device, to put it very, I'm not going to go into the terminology much, but there's this electrode system that they're trying to implant surgically into your skull. And Gertrude the pig received a surgical implant. The aim of Neuralink and these different surgical implant technologies is that there's a lot of neurological issues and conditions and problems that we're trying to solve out there. So their premise is that they want to build a generalized brain device, quoting here, that is reliable and affordable. Keep that in mind, reliable and affordable. There's a bunch on here. How many? There's 12 different conditions on here. And you'll see that there's also quite a variety in them. It's not just focusing on neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or Huntington's. There's a wide range. We're talking about blindness, all the way through addiction, to stroke, to paralysis, to sleep issues, to depression and other mental health conditions. So think about how wide of a range they're trying to solve here. We're going to come back to this a little bit later. Right, so let's see. Oh, there's Elon Musk. His hope is that this can all be solved with Neuralink, basically. So as this lady says, this all sounds great in theory, but is it actually possible? Now, this is not to say that Neuralink is like absolutely pioneering stuff like, oh my God, this has never been done before. That's not the case. This technology has been around for a while. You see this a lot in the news, and of course there's steps, right? It's always advancing in small steps. The big sci-fi stuff is perhaps yet to come, but the main issue that Neuralink is also trying to fix is that these devices that we pick up on surgically and implant them into the skull and the brain, they're oftentimes, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that surgery is dangerous anytime. So you imagine just popping something into your skull. There's a lot of considerations to be made, of course. And for all these conditions, imagine if you are someone who's facing one medical condition like seizures, but you also have comorbidities, like you are also struggling with depression right now or paralysis or different conditions. we can't exactly have technologies that are like, oh, this one we're going to implant for depression treatment. Specifically, we're going to implant this for seizures support a little bit. Can't have like 10 million different things in your brain. We can't measure 10 different million things at once, right? All these conditions come together, they intersect. So Neuralink and many other companies are trying to focus on generalizing. How can we, it's kind of like a one size fits all model, which is a weird thing to say because we know they're so complex, but that's kind of the premise a little bit, I would say, what they're trying to do. Some neat visuals here. We don't know much about the human brain still. We're still at the tip of the iceberg, as we like to say, right? So there's a lot of mystery, is what they're touching on. Their first Neuralink demo happened in July 2019, which is actually 2 years ago now. Wow. And this surgical device I'm speaking about, they have these different threads that go into the brain, and they monitor individual neurons. Can you imagine? Like little itty bitty little ones. So a lot of minute level complexity there. They now have these threads from this coin that you see here, and they put that directly into the skull. Gertrude the pig got that surgery, and they are basically going to show you a neat demo of her electrical activity coming from the Neuralink in her head. So whenever she's moving around, you see Gertrude there. She touches something with her nose or her snout, it's sending out these neural spikes of activity, right? So they're now talking about how did neuroscience get to this point. We have known for a while, like I mentioned, that thoughts, moods, actions, everything are kind of dependent on neurons, electrical activity. And we have the brain mapped reasonably well. We generally know like this movement corresponds to this action, yada, 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 like I mentioned before, with the executive function around here and whatnot. So healthy and happy pig, apparently. All right. There's this neat little demo that they show with her walking. I'm trying to get to that part. There we are. She's on a treadmill, and the implant measurement of her activity actually corresponds with her movements, which is really neat. They're aligned, you can see there. Again, spoiler alert, this is not novel though. Neuroscientists have been recording brain activity for a while now, especially with mice in the lab setting. You can see there are fish. Oh, look at that fish. Navigation, things like that. But Neuralink is trying to push that further. That is the big part. Monkeys, right? There's this demonstration of prosthetic devices for patients who are paralyzed, and they can control cursors with their mind. So this is previous research. Oh, like they're playing that game there. So I'm gonna pause right there so we can chat a little bit more. The big complaint about Neuralink sometimes is that it's a lot of press, and there actually is much going on behind the scenes, It's a really big endeavor. You saw that there were so many, let's move on. There we go. There's so much that they're trying to tackle out there. Sometimes it is like a sci-fi movie in some ways. And the big issue is that this is not only a neuroscience problem or a tech problem to address, but it's both of them coming together. Something bigger is what the video leaves on, which is interesting to think about. How is this, not just a neuro problem or a tech problem, but bigger than those both? So I have some questions here for us to talk about. First, feasibility-wise, do you think it's even practical for companies to try to target, generalized implants like these? Surgery is obviously something to think about, right? Surgery is something to think about. So what are your thoughts on, actually needing to surgically implant things? We're not, Mom mentioned the EEG headband before. That's not invasive. It's a headband, basically, kind of similar to a headband. So you're not hurting anyone in the long term, causing potential life-threatening conditions. So I didn't show this part in the clip, but Elon mentions that the goal is to go for almost a complete AI symbiosis. Thinking about computer, human, symbiosis together, completely crazy. What do you think about that too? Is that really where we want to go? And then last but not least, disparities, right? We mentioned surgery is like ding, ding, ding. That is the very tip of the iceberg. Surgery is expensive. Are these going to be actually, life-saving things? Are these like therapeutics that go beyond insurance companies' scope? And of course, I know we're coming from different countries and different healthcare systems here, but how do we navigate that? Are these essential treatments? Are these good to have? An interesting concept is that Neuralink is also trying to connect your brain with your phone and your mobile devices and laptops and whatnot. So it's not just about, these therapeutics. Is it something that's going to turn more commercial? Who's going to be prioritized in that case? Is it going to be the patients? Is it going to be, let's make more money by connecting your brain to your mobile device? How is this going to work exactly? The rollout, how is this going to work? So I want to open it up to everyone now. I know that's a very general introduction to Neuralink. So obviously we don't have a million hours to spend together, but what are some thoughts that are coming to mind for you so far? There's a lot of hot topics and hot controversies about this right now on Reddit and whatnot, a lot of places. And feel free to comment on any of these questions. These are just suggestions. Great. So Mohammed says there's a lot of implications that may be unaccounted for, right? The brain is dynamic. Sometimes you expect one thing and something completely different comes out. So it's very unpredictable, kind of like a black box in that sense. Yeah, we really don't know.
Also, I liked how you have equitable there as well. That's a really good, topic to kind of start thinking about, because if this technology was to become commercialized, then of course it might be quite expensive and might not be affordable for individuals that don't really have a lot of money to spend. So I feel like that's a really important consideration to everyone participating in the Researchathon. Since we are kind of focusing on inequity and inaccessibilities that are present in our societies right now.
Absolutely, right. Neuralink has mentioned, this is a little bit more context I'll add, is that they are going to want to test out kind of in the first human trials in patients who are paralyzed, spinal cord injuries, for instance, they're not able to move, and see if they would be able to control devices with their brain, with the neural activity. Human trials, though, is always a very complicated process, to go from the lab to Gertrude the pig, the monkeys, the primates, and then onto human trials. There's things to think about. Like who, for instance, is going to be included in those trials? One of the big things in a lot of neuroscience research is that we still don't have adequate representation of non-Caucasian patients in these studies. So oftentimes you'll see a lot of these, in the big science papers and the journals, there'll be like limitations include this study population was like 76% white, oftentimes male as well. So there's obviously biological differences due to sex in the brain. Men and women literally have different, brain structures for different aspects. There are biological differences, and that's proven. But we also have to consider, like, this device on paper seems like a one-size-fits-all. That doesn't really work like that for every single individual. We all have, our brain, the general anatomy, maybe encompassing for everyone, maybe the same for everyone, but we all have different childhoods. We all develop and grow differently. We all eat different things, come from different areas of different, climate environments, pollution levels, whatnot, family medical history. There's a lot of comorbidities and other conditions that can pop up, right? So it definitely is not a one size fits all when you bring it to the clinical setting. So you consider as well. Yeah. Equity is one of the big issues that a lot of neurotechnology companies will be addressing. And so we have what can you say about the effectiveness of neurotech? Yeah, for non-invasive devices, like put this headset on, put this headband on, put this wrist measuring device on. Those are much more easy to play around with. But when you start getting invasive and you start getting into surgery, how are you going to address the effectiveness without accidentally harming someone? Yeah, that's a really great question there. is how Neuralink might change the world and our societies and how fast these changes might occur. That's a great point. Pace of development. A little bit earlier, we were chatting about how, academia research, is going one route, one pace. And these like neurotechnology-based startups, companies and whatnot, the industry side are going a different pace. So how do we bring those together? Do those need to be brought together as a counter argument? Does academia inform technology and industry, or can it also be the other way around? There's definitely a two-way street there. Think about policy and governmental implications. There is not the level of policy that's accounting for like how are we regulating these products has not caught up to the technology, not at all. There's always these hearings and different things that you see, but there still is quite a lag. So how do you account for potential, maybe intentional or intentional misuse of these products for making money and profits? If these are going to be commercialized, there's obviously some that are like, oh, you can, I can't think of a good example right now, but there are some products that you clearly know are not meant for, usage in hospitals in the clinical setting, but they're more like, this is such a bad example. I can't think of something, apologies, but you can connect with this device to play video games together with your friends and you can all connect just using your brains. Maybe that's going to be an ad in the future, right? It's not anything related to, the clinical setting, but in those cases, like, maybe different regulations for those, and yeah, a lot of gray areas at the end of the day. Data ownership is one, right? If you receive an implant from Neuralink, for instance, what is the legal connection between you as a recipient of that device now that is surgically implanted versus someone who can throw a headband or a wristband in the trash that they've purchased? Yes. Yeah, funding sources are really big. Like, definitely need is one part. Like, there are folks who would be neat to have something that could connect to your iPhone. You don't need to use AirDrop anymore. You just go, there it is. But the rollout, I think that's the big key part, is how is the rollout going to work? Is it going to be people who can pay for it, like Mohammed mentioned? Like, how are you going to pay for it? Is it going to be folks who are qualified through like clinical trials, clinical studies, research institutions? Is it something that you pre-order like Tesla cars? Go on a website, fill it out, voila, you've got yourself an invasive surgery booked. How does that work? A lot of things. So keep those in mind. Keep those in mind. There's a lot of gray areas. That's what's important too. Okay, I'm not gonna, go. Come on, there we go. So I think we already shared all of our reflections and comments and thoughts. So I just want to take a quick minute here. Oh, go ahead.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so I had this question. What aspect of neuroscience do you find the most mind stimulating?
Very debatable. Very debatable. Neurotechnology is definitely very, it's on fire right now. Like, everyone is thinking about, because the thing about neurotechnology is it's taking the research and it's applying it to some place that's like tangible, right? It's not just like, oh, we now know that mice are able to navigate this maze using yada, 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 but it's aggregating that and trying to say, here's what we know about spatial navigation in mice. But in humans, like, maybe we can connect your brain to your GPS, so you don't need actually to carry it around or something like that, right? So I think I want to say neurotechnology seems like the most hot topic in the field right now, but I also don't want to discount that it's coming from the framework of a lot of different research innovations across the board in academia. So it's like the foundation you don't really see as much. You see like the big, the pedestal part, right? So that, I would say, is what I sense. I also sense that on Twitter a lot, which is a bad way to sense the landscape. But yeah, that is one route, I would say. And oh my gosh, there's always something new for every branch. Like, understanding memory is still, there's still a lot to go, still the tip of the iceberg. Understanding how to cure Alzheimer's, for instance, I think the FDA released like a new drug approval a few weeks back. Everyone is like up in arms about it because there are some issues with it. So there's always kind of a tug of war sometimes between these different fields too. I think Hiram dropped this TED Talk link on human senses. Maybe worth checking it out. Great question though. Yeah.
Thank
We
you
still have
so
a few
much.
more, of course. And we still have a few more slides and we're gonna do like more question chatting. I just wanna run through these very quick because I've given you Neuralink as an example. It seems a little bit sketchy at times, seems really cool at times. But here are some actually really proven, currently being implemented in the field examples of innovation. You've got deep brain stimulation, which is basically where this is also a surgical procedure. These two different electrodes, and I'm using two as an example, that's in literature, but these electrodes are implanted into the brain. Specific centers that are involved in Parkinson's disease that go awry, different. And they can help control tremors for Parkinson's disease patients. To set the stage a little bit of what Parkinson's is, it's a neurodegenerative disease that's linked to a chemical called dopamine. And oftentimes patients will have motor deficits. So they may have tremors in their hands, their arms, they may have kind of a staggering walking movement. So it helps with tremors for Parkinson's patients. Prosthetics that feel pain may seem a little bit counterintuitive because who wants to feel pain? But imagine, if you are in a motor vehicle accident and you receive, a limb amputation in the hospital, you receive a prosthetic arm, and let's say you're sitting too close to the fire on a really nice evening by the campfire, and you don't realize that your prosthetic arm is, we're literally right next to the fire. Pretty common issue, actually. It's also really, it can be life-threatening, right? And so scientists are trying to figure out, how can we program pain and these pain impulses into your devices, because it's really important to keep yourself out of harm's way. For individuals who are suffering from paralysis, there are these new forms of rehabilitation and physical therapies that are trying to, not just focus on how are we going to work with your arms and, do these different kinds of exercises, but let's also leverage the power of your brain, right? Your brain is controlling your motor function. It's much more complicated than that. It's a very broad summary, but there's applications in rehabilitation services too. Last but not least by any way, this is not a comprehensive list, is for children with attention deficit hyperactivity, early in the childhood, neurodevelopmental conditions. There is neurofeedback training that takes into account recording different brain waves that these children, that we all produce actually, that these children are producing, see if there's any irregularities that they can catch or odd patterns, and try to use that and leverage that in neurofeedback. Again, I'm not an expert in any of these, but I would highly recommend looking up more to learn about these. So that brings us to, actually we're gonna skip past this, core values to keep in mind. This comes into the whole ideation process because now as we start wrapping up our session, we have all these big questions. How do we tackle these as students? Sometimes we're like, what impact do we have in the field? We're just small folks in the field sometimes it seems, but we can also very much set the stage. We're talking about ethics and thinking about populations that we impact, and in that comes integrity and thoughtfulness. Science has been misused a lot. Things that are meant for good can be misused. That's unfortunately the way that the world has been. And we want to safeguard from that by thinking about, the science that we put out into the world, the research that we're doing, is it harming to certain populations? Is it harming, individuals with disabilities? Is it, taking advantage of their condition? Is this, taking advantage of individuals, minority communities, especially who would otherwise have no access to healthcare, so they're forced to enroll in your study for a chance at a life-saving drug treatment? All these different things to consider. Impact. Some technologies never see the light of day. They're always stuck in the lab. They never get the funding that they see. And it takes a lot of resilience to get past those stages when you have truly impactful research that you want to get out to the world. Sometimes, technologies impact 5 people, especially with individuals with rare conditions. Some technologies may impact, thousands and thousands of folks. Last 2 things I want to touch upon are that when we start ideating as students, next slide, through internships, through research laboratories at our schools, through classes. It requires teamwork. Tying it all back to that multidisciplinary lens. If you're an engineering student, you don't just want to be stuck in the engineering bubble. You want to think about, what is my pre-medical friend over here doing? They're really interested in medicine and life sciences. I wonder if we can work together. Intersection, biomedical engineering, for instance. Physics majors, neuro majors may not intersect very much. Chemistry majors may not intersect very much, but biochemical implications of all these, base things in the brain, got yourself an intersection there. So it's all about, seeing these similarities more so than differences, right? I think is a common statement. And building more informative teams that way. For instance, a cell might mean something different to a computer scientist, to a biologist, to a physicist, but that does not mean that jargon has to get in the way of having those discussions, thinking about, how can we leverage collective experience to get us further, right? So it can be intimidating, but I think universities and high schools and the school settings are so much more welcoming to reaching out to those kinds of connections, than, let's say, when you're later in the job field, in the workforce. It can be a little bit more intimidating and time consuming and less of those spaces to collaborate. So, wow, would you look at that? We're at a really innovative based event right now. So this is a perfect start to start forming those connections, right? But of course, there's coursework, there's clubs, there's internships. There's seeking out entrepreneurship activities and workshops. All these technologies did not start from companies who already had prior funding. Not really, unless you're Elon Musk. Well, kudos to you. We're all starting from scratch most of the time. And these experiences that we develop, we're not just gonna walk into a PhD program one day and be like, I am now an expert now that I have a PhD. It doesn't work that way. It's a process. So even at the undergrad level, you may want to take coursework that is a little bit outside of your major program or your degree program if you have the opportunity to. Take that engineering design principles class, or maybe go check out what the makerspace is doing. I know degree programs also vary in rigidity and focus from college to college. So there's also a lot of online resources out there. I'll type into the chat. Coursera and EDX, I'm a super big fan. Excuse me. Fortunately, I can't pull up the links right now because my Zoom is sharing, but they have a wonderful multitude of these online courses and sequences that you don't have to pay to study and learn from. YouTube is a big resource, I would say. Keeping up on, Twitter is kind of underrated and overrated. It's a finicky social media platform, but it's also a really nice way to follow along with scientists in the field who regularly tweet and share about their work. What was I gonna say? Internships, clubs. Try to connect with students who share similar interests with you. And also those that we mentioned, share slightly different interests. I actually was not super keen on learning more about neurotech until about a few months back. It was during the COVID pandemic. I guess we're now still in the pandemic. A few months back, I ran into a friend who was really interested in things related to neurotech. Is building a startup from the ground up. Does she know that it's going to be an absolute success or not? No one knows, but it's for the experience and, hopefully creating an impact along the way. But connecting with people is truly, truly amazing. Because it doesn't require you to necessarily sit down and take that course and get that certification all by yourself, but rather it can give you an opportunity to exchange information and hopefully can spark something, right? So we're all here today. We've been exchanging some thoughts. You may want to continue the conversation with some folks from the event, right? If you're connecting over Slack, Discord, whatnot, LinkedIn too. LinkedIn is a wonderful place. So TLDR, what I want to tell you is that I really want to encourage you to step outside of your boundaries a little bit. Maybe a lot of you folks are not pursuing neuroscience degrees right now. Maybe you're just really curious to learn more what's going on. You don't have to have a degree to go in one route, and you don't have to be an expert to chat and take part in conversations about different issues, right? Maybe perhaps you could take this little bit of intro knowledge and go explore more about Neuralink and tell your family about it. Actually start those conversations. So lot of ways to get involved. I just want to encourage you to check out career paths as well. I believe I'm blanking. I believe I shared my slides with Julia, so hopefully these will be shared with you guys as well, recording. But bioinformatics, cognitive science, computational avenues, linguistics. There's a lot of different avenues to go in the data sciences, pharma, biotech, and whatnot. And this honestly came from a quick Google search. There's plenty of different websites out there that show you, what are some avenues to go with the skills that you have currently, or the reverse direction. If you want to go into bioinformatics, here's what you should focus on a little bit more, explore a little bit more. That is to say, none of these are straightforward paths. They definitely are complicated, and you can forge your own journey to get to these destinations. So that is all for today. We are almost out of time. We got 6-7 more minutes left. I just want to open it up to any questions you all may have. I'm by no means an expert on, different technologies, still learning in the journey as well. If you'd love to connect, be happy to, please reach out. And if you're ever looking for more of the neuroscience related resources, or you're interested in exploring more, feel free to also reach out and I can help connect you with different things online. So yeah, thank you so much everyone for hopping on today.
Thank you, Chinmayi. So the floor is open for questions. If you have any, feel free to ask them.
So I had a question. I don't know if it's gonna make any sense. So I'm from economics background, so I'm kind of fascinated with this topic. I've always been, since some of my friends are studying in biotechnology and microbiology. So they've always been very fascinated about genetic engineering. So I wanted to ask, is STEM kind of in any way correlated or linked with genetic engineering?
Oh, absolutely. I think that would fit into the sciences a little bit more, though also, of course, engineering is in the name itself. The thing about STEM is I should actually look a little bit more into the history of how it came to be. I'm not quite sure, a lot of knowledge. But kind of the way it functions is kind of like an overlap umbrella term to say anything related to the sciences, the innovation. Some folks like please be sure to keep on mute. But so I'm guilty of, just referring to STEM as science. Some people do like STEM is tech, STEM is engineering. But I would say it's definitely is STEM. Even economics, for instance, is not quite by definition of the term STEM fit into STEM. If I had a bingo card for how many times I said STEM today, it would be filled. But it does not mean that economics cannot connect to STEM, I would say, at the end of the day, right? Like neuroeconomics is really big, actually, behavioral economics, and trying to see how cognitive patterns of thinking and all these different techniques, like how can we leverage that in economics, which is neat and also kind of scary. How do you make those split-second decisions? So I would absolutely say there's a lot of overlap. Yeah, even if it doesn't like on paper fit into the acronym necessarily. Great question.